Hi everybody, it's right at 1 o'clock, so we're going to go ahead and get started with our webinar today. Thanks so much for joining us. My name is Todd Latiolis. I'm the Prevention and Policy Administrator with Governor Abbott's Child Sex Trafficking team, and we're going to be talking today about some legislative updates from the most recent 86th session. I did want to go ahead and start with just a few housekeeping items. First of all, the phones are muted, so if you're trying to ask any questions, they'll be muted for the rest of the webinar, but you should have a question box there that you're able to type in any questions, and we'll save some time at the end to get to those. And just keep in mind, nothing in this presentation is legal advice or a formal interpretation of any sort of statute, and it's not going to be an exhaustive overview of everything that happened during session, but we're going to capture as much as we can. Also, I did want to let you know that we will be making copies of these slides available to you all after the webinar, so don't worry about furiously taking pictures of any slides or trying to capture any of that. We'll be sure to share that with you, and if all goes well, a recording should also be available to those that want to revisit anything or want to share this with others that couldn't make it. So with that, I did want to get into a little bit of background about our team, just for those that don't know. For those that aren't familiar with the legislative process in Texas, we're really an early adopter of human trafficking legislation. The first federal law on trafficking was in 2000, and in 2003, we became one of only 2 states that had human trafficking as a specific criminal statute in our code. So we've been doing this for a while, but we've had a lot to learn. Back in 2003, that law required victims to be moved from place to place, for example, which is no longer a requirement. So we learn more and more every year, and our laws evolve, but we are a leader across the country in legislation. There's an organization called Shared Hope International, and they actually grade every state on their legislation to respond to child sex trafficking. And in the first year that they did that, Texas was one of only 4 states that had a B letter grade. That was the highest grade. And in the most recent report, we're now an A. So there still is room to improve in that, but there is a lot that has been going well over the past now 16 years in Texas. Our team was created by statute in 2015, and you can sort of see here a visualization of how we approach our work. In 2015, the legislature passed a law to create this team within the governor's office, and on the next slide, you'll see some of our charge that's in the government code. But we were charged with everything from prevention and protecting children from being exploited, to improving recognition, to helping children to exit that exploitation through recovery, to support their long-term healing, and to support efforts to bring justice. So you can see each of our strategies there around the start, with the child and the youth, always being at the center of everything that we do. I'm going to walk through the legislative process kind of following this star. Not everything fits really neatly into a protection piece of legislation or a bringing justice piece of legislation, but we are going to kind of walk through that way. Here you can see just that section from the government code that outlines each of those areas that we're tasked with working on. I'm not going to be focusing much on our strategies or things that we're doing around the state. This presentation is more about the legislative update. So feel free to go to our website. We'll have that listed at the end. There's tons of information about our grantees and our programs and the way that we pursue each of these strategies, but that's not going to be the focus of today. So one last little piece of background and context before we get into the specific legislation. I just wanted to set the stage on a couple of definition issues in Texas. You can see here that trafficking under the Texas Penal Code can apply to a few different actors. The first there is the person that knowingly traffics the child, the actual trafficker themselves that causes that child to become the victim of commercial sexual exploitation. The second in our trafficking statute is the person that receives a benefit from that venture. So if they knowingly are benefiting from that activity, whether they are a motel owner that is part of that enterprise, or somebody else that's benefiting from that enterprise, they are also complicit in the crime of trafficking. And finally, the person that actually engages in sexual conduct with the trafficked child. So that buyer, according to the penal code, is complicit in the crime of trafficking as well. And it's important to note that, yes, sort of the mental element here is that you knowingly engaged in this trafficking activity, but that doesn't mean that the actor had to know the age of the child. So if you knowingly trafficked a person and you thought they were 20, but they happen to be 16, you still are going to be guilty of trafficking a child or engaging in that sexual conduct with a child. And you can see those elements highlighted here. First is the trafficking, which is recruiting, obtaining, maintaining. It does not mean moving from place to place like it did back in 2003. Secondly, you caused the activity. If it's a victim over 18, you caused that through force, fraud, or coercion. We had some small changes to that this session we'll talk about later. But if that's a victim under the age of 18, there's no force, fraud, or coercion required. Any means that they engage in that activity counts there. Again, that's a change. In 2003, even children, you had to show force, fraud, or coercion. Finally, the actual activity. What did you cause them to engage in or to become the victim of? And the top there, you can see both for adults and for minors, any of that prostitution-related activity is covered in the sex trafficking statute. So if an adult has been forced into that activity, or if a child is engaged by any means in that activity, they're a victim of trafficking in the state of Texas. That online promotion of prostitution is actually new from this session. We'll note that a bit later. And the last note there is our law is actually more protective of kids. So in addition to those prostitution-related activities, the law also says that if a kid is engaged in things like sexual performance or employment harmful to a minor, think of kids that are being exploited in strip clubs, that activity could also qualify under the trafficking statute. And the last definitional thing that a lot of people often overlook is that trafficking in Texas is a form of child abuse. Ever since 2011, the legislature has included trafficking specifically in the family code as a form of abuse. So that means all of our requirements to be mandatory reporters of child abuse, all of our required trainings on child abuse, prevention of child abuse, should be incorporating trafficking as a form of abuse. And it is true that in Texas, our child welfare system will only have jurisdiction in those instances where it's a person responsible for their care, custody, and control. So typically a parent or guardian that's trafficking that child. But it's also important to note that the law is broad enough to include those parents that fail to make a reasonable effort to protect the child. So if the parent knows that that activity is happening and they're not taking reasonable efforts to prevent it, our child welfare system can be involved in those cases. Now, without any further background and context, let's dive into the legislative session. And I apologize in advance, some of these words are pretty text heavy, but bills and laws are text heavy, and I want you to have this resource. First, just a little helpful context from session. Over 7,300 House and Senate bills were filed during the 86th session. Less than 20% of those bills actually became law. Most of those died at some point in the process. They never made it out of committee. A very small percentage, less than 1%, were vetoed by the governor, and that's why they didn't become law. But you can see there's a flurry of activity that happens during session. That's because for those that aren't aware, or those that are joining from out of state, in Texas, our session only meets in odd-numbered years, so they convene for 140 days in odd-numbered years. So it's a fairly short window of time for them to pass this legislation, and as you can see, they were very busy with over 7,300 bills filed. I did want to make a note about some appropriations that were made in the state budget for the biennium. So this is for the 2-year period, 2020 to 2021. All of these, with the exception of the very first housing appropriation, are specific trafficking related appropriations. I include that $3 million to housing and community affairs because that appropriation is specifically to focus on the crisis of homeless youth in our urban areas. And we know, as those in the field, that homelessness is one of the primary risk factors for kids. They often are vulnerable to being targeted by traffickers, but they're also looking for ways to get their basic needs met. And at times that can be through a buyer or exploiter that's offering them those basic needs in exchange for their bodies. So that's an important preventative measure that happened this session. From our office, the Office of the Governor, we received the same appropriation we have in the last 2 sessions for our team. That $5.6 million covers our team. It also covers grants related to our programs. The Governor's office also operates what the bill calls prostitution prevention grants. We saw a small increase in that funding. That's funding that can go directly to counties in Texas that can apply to our office to engage in programs that prevent prostitution. And what's new for that this year is that they also include pre-arrest diversion programs, so opportunities to intervene early on and prevent criminalization of these individuals. Our child welfare system previously had a small trafficking team that was funded by a grant from our office. The legislature has picked up the tab for that team, and now they are no longer reliant on grant funding. They will have a constant division there in child welfare to respond to trafficking within the system. TxDOT got a small appropriation to do trafficking signage across the state and transportation hubs. Our Department of Licensing and Regulation, which, goodness, licenses so many things. You maybe see the TDLR sign when you're on an elevator because they've inspected. You see it when you're at the nail salon, at the barber. They even license mixed martial artists. So they have a very full plate. They had identified massage establishments as a high-risk location that they license. And so they asked for money for a small team to look at inspections of massage establishments related to trafficking, and they got that appropriation. Our Alcoholic and Beverage Commission has really always been a key player when it comes to responding to trafficking. They uncovered one of the first cases in Texas years ago in a bar, but they had never had a specific appropriation, and they now have that. And then finally, when it comes to law enforcement, there was an appropriation made to the Department of Public Safety to create regional trafficking squads around the state. And our trafficking unit in the Attorney General's office also saw an expansion through an appropriation this session. So I know that's a lot, but none of these individual things are specific bills that passed. They were all part of the budget bill, but they all do have a big role in moving us forward in the state, both in protecting the vulnerable, but also responding to exploitation. Because the legislature really invested a significant amount of money for the first time, a lot of those appropriations were new appropriations this session, which is fantastic that the legislature decided to do that. But in connection with that, they want to be sure that they understand how the money is being spent and how each of these agencies are working together to plan and make sure we're not being redundant with the appropriations that we've been given and that we're all on the same page. So ever since 2009, we've had a statewide task force that the legislature created. But this year, the legislature felt like we could be doing even more beyond the task force to get on the same page. So they created this subset, which is the Human Trafficking Prevention Coordinating Council. So most of these folks are members of the statewide task force, but this is a much smaller list that you see in front of you. And the role of this core group of people is to develop a 5-year strategic plan for the state, to get together, to all get on the same page about what will it take to address trafficking effectively in our state, and to submit a 5-year plan. This group is also charged with inventorying all the programs and services available around the state, and again, to make sure that our expenditures are coordinated. I did want to note that while the list is defined in statute, it was broad enough to allow other state agencies to be added if we felt like someone was missing. For example, you may notice that the Health and Human Services Commission was not on this list. And in our first meeting, it was really obvious that that was a critical missing partner. So we have opportunities to add those key members moving forward. I just discussed the task force and how it's been around since 2009. Part of the role of the task force is to study trafficking, to provide trainings on trafficking, but also very importantly to make legislative recommendations on trafficking. In each session, there's typically what folks call the task force bill. This is typically an omnibus bill that encompasses a long laundry list of recommendations from the task force. What you see in front of you are task force recommendations that actually passed as part of Senate Bill 20, which was the task force bill this session. Most of these we're going to be talking about components later on. For now, I'll just highlight that first bullet there, the new online offenses. You saw the online promotion of prostitution and aggravated online promotion were included in that definition slide just a moment ago. These are new offenses in Texas, and the reason they were created is because the federal partners recently enacted FOSTA SESTA. If you followed any of that, this was about looking at online exploitation in light of things like Backpage and other online providers that have become complicit in facilitating prostitution and trafficking. Because FOSTA SESTA now gives states the ability to pursue charges against online traffickers, to not worry about Communications Decency Act and federal provisions that previously prevented that, we now have a law to effectuate FOSTA SESTA at the state level. That's through those online promotion statutes. We'll be talking about the enhanced non-disclosure process later. That's basically a record sealing provision that's been streamlined for victims of trafficking. We also saw enhanced penalties for buyers this session. Now, those were all recommendations originally from the task force. There were a few recommendations that did not ultimately make it into the bill, but that passed in other bills or died along the way. I did also want to point out that there were other things in the task force bill that were not initially task force recommendations. So this second half of bullets are all things that were added on as amendments through the process. So some good things still that are happening as a result of that, but they were not initial recommendations. A couple of key things here are the HHSC, which I mentioned as a critical partner, and we're going to be focusing on those provisions later on in the presentation. Now, as I said, I'm going to walk through some of the legislative updates going by the points of our stars and the way that we understand our strategies. A lot of these fit into multiple areas. And this is not an exhaustive list by any means, but I do want to use that approach to talk about this legislation. Like I said, I'm not going to talk about most of our team strategies as we go, but there are a few areas that I'll note, just some contextual items that I think are worth noting. For example, when it comes to protect, for us and our strategy of protection, we're primarily talking about prevention. But folks use the word prevention in a lot of different ways. For example, our team and statute is actually the Child Sex Trafficking Prevention Unit. The statewide task force is a prevention task force. The council is a prevention coordinating council. But those groups all do things much broader than just preventing trafficking. They identify trafficking. They provide services to victims. So when I talk about prevention for these purposes, I just want to clarify what we mean by that. For our team, prevention is something that happens before victimization occurs. We're focused heavily on primary prevention. What you see in front of you is a visualization from the CDC and their veto violence program and how they understand prevention from a public health approach. And so we're really looking at how we can prevent trafficking from happening before it occurs, but also recognize that providing services and stopping the bad guys can be forms of secondary and tertiary prevention because they do prevent additional victimization from occurring. So when we think about primary prevention, what are some things that happened this session? Well, I want to spotlight specifically some changes in our school system. House Bill 111, which actually went into effect for this school year, the 2019-2020 school year, clarifies that sex trafficking has to be included in schools' policies and trainings, including awareness efforts towards students, prevention techniques that are provided as part of training to employees, and also some of that secondary, tertiary prevention. How do those kids get the assistance that they need? Now, schools have been required to have policies and trainings on all of this for child abuse for several years. And because trafficking is a form of child abuse, it should have been incorporated. But what we found was that most schools weren't thinking about sex trafficking as part of their child abuse prevention policy. So the legislature added that explicitly this session. And the other thing that they added onto that is that as you're looking at those policies and trainings for abuse and trafficking, you need to specifically consider children with cognitive disabilities and their increased vulnerability for all these different forms of exploitation. Another thing I wanted to note that's not so much a legislative update, but more about administrative rules. We have had in Texas for many years, gosh, at least the early 90s, probably before that, a provision in our education code that says schools have to provide anti-victimization programs, both at the elementary and secondary level. And that's all that it says. It doesn't really provide guidance on what an anti-victimization program is. You can tell maybe that that's been around a while just by the name of it itself. But what we do have going on right now are some administrative rule updates from the Texas Education Agency. So those were posted about a month ago, and the public comment period just ended recently. So depending on the feedback that happened during that public comment period, we should be seeing effective rules sometime in November. And there was a lot to those rules, but the one thing I want to highlight is clarification for schools on what we mean by those anti-victimization programs. And TEA, at least in their rule draft, clarified that what we mean by that is research-based, age-appropriate prevention education. This is education we need to be providing to our students to make sure they know how to stay safe, but they also know how to avoid recruitment, grooming, and they know what it means to talk to a safe and trusted adult if they ever feel unsafe. The other thing that I wanted to highlight when it comes to a spotlight on schools actually might not have been very obvious to a lot of folks, but it was Senate Bill 11. Senate Bill 11 is actually the massive school safety bill that passed this past session. School safety was an emergency item for the governor going into session. There was a lot of conversation around school shootings that had taken place and what we need to have a safer environment for students in schools. So this is a very long bill that looks at all of those things, but there are a few components that I think really highly overlap with our goal of preventing exploitation. For example, as part of Senate Bill 11, there is new funding available to schools through the school safety allotment. And there are several different allowable costs under the school safety allotment, but one of those allowable costs includes safety and security training, which according to the language of the statute can include prevention and treatment programs related to adverse childhood experiences. And we know that if we do a good job of addressing various adverse childhood experiences, early onsets of abuse, other types of ACEs, that we do prevent trafficking and a whole host of other negative outcomes. So I think if schools can be savvy and recognize that if part of the reason they weren't responding to ACEs previously was a lack of funding, that there is some opportunity through that school safety allotment to consider that. The second piece is training targeted at staff. The bill anticipates that schools will train staff on a trauma-informed care approach, understanding the role of trauma in students' development and their behavior and their educational settings. And that will be a list of trauma-informed education programs that will be approved that they'll have to utilize. But again, recognizing if teachers can understand that trauma, they may understand these kids from hard places and why they sometimes act the way that they do and why we don't see disclosures of trafficking oftentimes from those that have been exploited. Finally, there were a couple of provisions that direct specifically to how students are educated. One is going to be an update on curriculum around digital citizenship. So this includes appropriate, responsible, healthy use of the internet. And we know so many kids are vulnerable because of their access to the internet and social media. So again, implemented a certain way, we could incorporate recognizing some of that online safety and citizenship as a part of this curriculum. And finally, school districts offer an enrichment curriculum that covers a variety of subjects, but one of those is health. And one of the changes to the enrichment curriculum for health as a result of this session includes education about establishing and maintaining positive relationships. There was research recently from the University of Texas that interviewed a number of survivors of child sex trafficking around the state. And what they found in that research was that the number one gap for those survivors was a healthy, trusted, positive relationship in their life. So if we can do a better job of making sure that we understand what that means, how to manage them, and how to build them, then we will have a major protective factor in the life of these youth. At the end of each of these sections, we've got a list just like you see it here so that you can have as a resource. And we're not going to go into all of these laws just for lack of time. But each of those bills you can see is a hyperlink to the legislature's website where you can actually pull up the text of that statute if you're interested in learning a little bit more. A couple of things I just wanted to highlight from this list include there in the middle, House Bill 1865. That includes a number of massage therapy regulations. Several of those were actually originally part of the task force bill, but didn't end up staying in that bill due to a number of procedural issues. But those recommendations did pass through 1865. And again, that's looking at how we regulate massage establishments to make sure that we're not having trafficking that's occurring in those locations. We also saw some provisions around having posting of the National Human Trafficking Hotline in massage schools and establishments as a result of laws this session. A lot of these have a couple of pages of laws because so much did happen this session. The other one I wanted to highlight here was actually a resolution that passed, so not quite the same as a bill, but it recognized human trafficking as a public health issue. So that doesn't necessarily change the way that we respond to any systems, but if we do recognize trafficking as a public health issue, as the legislature has suggested, then that can inform the way we approach prevention and services to trafficking. Now, I'm going to move on to the second point of our STAR, and that's recognize. And the reason I want to talk about the importance of improving recognition around the state is because trafficking, as you all know, is hiding in plain sight in our state and in our systems. So one of our strategies from the governor's office was to select a screening tool to help providers identify trafficking in kids they were already serving. And the reason we felt that was so important is just look at this research right in front of you. This is from the validation of the screening tool that we utilize, which is the SEIT tool, the Commercial Sexual Exploitation Identification Tool. When they were validating that tool, they were working in 10 different nonprofits that serve victims. And what they found was that 3/4 of the survivors identified had been being exploited for 2 or more years before anybody ever identified it. Similarly, 3/4 of kids didn't see themselves as being exploited. So that means if we are going to depend upon kids to self-identify or to disclose their trafficking victimization before we, as the adults in their lives, are responding to that, we're going to miss out on a lot of these kids because they're going to endure more trauma because it's going to last longer, and they're often not going to disclose that victimization. Also, was pretty surprising, I think, to the folks validating that tool is that a good number of the kids were actually 14 or younger at the time that the exploitation first occurred. So that doesn't mean that was their age at the time they were identified, but they did have ACEs and other exploitation that were starting at an early age that had failed to be intervened upon. I also wanted to give just a nod to our state agencies for the awareness that they're already doing around the state. If you haven't seen the Attorney General's Be the One documentary, it is an excellent training tool to recognize the signs of trafficking. The governor actually requires all of his staff here in the governor's office to watch that film as part of mandatory employee training. And he has challenged all state agencies to do the same. There have been over 100,000 state employees that have been trained just as a result of that challenge. You also see On the Road to End Human Trafficking, that's TxDOT, our Department of Transportation's campaign to improve awareness of trafficking. These posters are up in restroom stalls at travel centers all across the state. They include language that is survivor friendly and gives them information on how to find help. And they were doing this even before session, and during session, the legislature decided to require them to do this. So that's where you saw that little pot of money for them to continue these efforts. TABC has been training beer distributors about how to look for trafficking as they're going into locations where they're providing those beverages. The First Lady also recorded some PSAs with TABC to help spread the word about trafficking. And finally, there on the left, you can see the Can You See Me campaign materials, which are part of a partnership with the A21 campaign. And just today, actually, a billboard campaign all across the state of Texas launched out of Houston today. So with the Outdoor Advertising Association and others, traditional and digital billboard space has been donated in 70 different communities around the state. So expect to see some messaging for Can You See Me? And this covers a variety of forms of exploitation and demographics. So we hope folks can open their eyes to see what trafficking really looks like. That it's not a very young person with duct tape on their mouth and held in chains. If that's what we're looking for, we're going to miss it 95% of the time. So it's important to truly recognize what trafficking is. So with that, there was some legislation that happened this session that affected how we train and raise awareness on trafficking. What you see in front of you right now is actually laws that existed prior to this session. So were already laws that dealt either with mandatory training or making training available to each of these entities that you see up here. That includes not only training, but also awareness through hotline posters. For example, it was previously required that posters about the National Human Trafficking Hotline be posted in certain bars, in the restrooms of sexually oriented businesses, actually in emergency departments as well. That was all law before this session. Things that were added this session include in our education field. Previously, educator training was that child abuse training, and there was curriculum available. As a result of this session, training is required of educators. And the other thing that they did this session through House Bill 403 was require training on child abuse and trafficking for school board members and for superintendents of districts. So you can imagine if we're training folks at the top in those districts, they're going to want to know what are we doing in our district, not only to improve awareness, but to educate our students and to reach our families and to refer kids that need help to get help. Within licensing regulations, we talked already about massage and how that's been impacted both with posters and with training within that industry. Within transportation, we also talked about TxDOT's hotline poster campaign. There was also a law that passed saying that TxDOT employees needed to have training available to them on trafficking, which is actually something they were already doing voluntarily. As a result of that Be the One challenge, but now that's in statute. And finally, and a really big one, there was a bill that passed this session that requires healthcare practitioners to receive training on trafficking. Now, that bill is very broad, and it covers a whole laundry list of different types of professions. So that's going to be highly dependent on HHSC, our Health and Human Service Commission, identifying trainings that are available, making a list available of what trainings folks can use to satisfy this requirement. HHSC, to their credit, actually before session was already creating a healthcare related training for some of their contractors. I believe they're going to have to revisit that now to make sure it's appropriate for this broader set of healthcare practitioners. There's also a number of organizations that already have trainings for healthcare practitioners, so they'll have to look at those and see what's appropriate. And then because there are so many different professions tied to that, we're actually already seeing a lot of our boards in the state start to develop some rulemaking in response to this. So I know, for example, our nursing board has already proposed some rules. Pharmacy has actually already proposed some rules. We'll have to see more from the medical board, but a lot of that's going to be dependent on what HHSC makes available and approves as they're required to do under the statute. Again, here you just see a list of some of those bills. We talked about most of those. One here, House Bill 292, deals with peace officers and law enforcement. We've actually had mandatory training of 4 hours on trafficking for law enforcement since 2009. What this bill did was it actually incorporated that into their basic training academy. The language was sort of weird before. You couldn't complete this training until after you were out of the academy. So they just tweaked that a little bit so that you don't have to wait. And now TCOL, our commission on law enforcement that handles a lot of that training, can incorporate that into the actual basic training curriculum. Moving into how we recover and heal survivors in the state of Texas, this really is part of the heaviest lift for our team from the statute that created us in 2015. A lot of the work that we do is around not only improving identification, but making sure that folks are working together to meet the needs of kids that have been identified as victims. So I did just want to take a moment to note a little bit about the work that we're doing in this space. And please go to our website because there's so much more information there about these programs. But the way that we implement a lot of the provisions in the code about serving child sex trafficking victims is through grants and through partnerships. So we have grants for things like specialized advocates, for drop-in programs, for specialized placements for victims. And then we also are partnering with folks around the state to create a concept that we're calling care coordination. Care coordination is really just a multidisciplinary response to the service needs of these victims. Even in a community where there are lots of different services available, kids and their families often still fall through the cracks without that assistance of somebody helping to coordinate that care. Probably our biggest partner in developing care coordination are our children's advocacy centers across the state of Texas. They already are experts in convening multidisciplinary teams to deal with the needs of kids as it relates to the investigation and prosecution of child abuse. They have the ability to share information that's given to them within the law. And because trafficking is a form of child abuse already, this fits really neatly into the work that they do. So most of our care coordinators around the state will be those children's advocacy centers. They'll be the conveners that are able to bring everyone together, not just as it relates to investigation and prosecution, but also to the services that that child needs after that process has completed. Another big piece of the way that we approach our work is through our regional administrators. So you can see we have the state of Texas split up into these 5 regions. Each of these regions has an Office of the Governor Regional Administrator. Their contact information will be at the end if you live in one of these regions and want to get in touch about what's happening in your region. But really their role is to work with those partners on the ground and to assess the landscape of things from prevention to identification to the service response that we're talking about, and even into justice activities. So we want to be sure that in each of these regions, we have a full continuum of care and that our office is available and helpful in filling whatever gaps there might be, whether that's through grants from our office if necessary, or just bringing the right folks together to the table to collaborate and coordinate to fill those gaps in those communities. A couple of legislative updates I wanted to give that relate to recovery and to healing. One was in SB 20. We talked about those amendments that were added. This amendment is going to require Health and Human Services to basically designate what they call a health-related institute of higher education. So typically some form of medical school, some type of university that has that health component tied to it. And through that institution, they're going to operate a treatment program for child victims. So what does that look like? HHSC is going to have to do requests for information or requests for applications, give those schools an opportunity to submit their plans and how they would do that. But the vision is that that school would improve the quality of care and the accessibility of care for survivors in our community. And the way that the law envisions that is by improving inpatient care, improving outpatient care, providing opportunities for expansion of research and the workforce, and then ultimately, assuming that they're evaluating and testing and it goes well, to provide assistance to other health-related higher ed programs to possibly establish similar programs. So to me, this is just one tool in our toolkit. It's one component of a broad array of services that are needed. Not every identified victim is necessarily going to be a good fit for this program, in the same way that not every kid identified is going to go into foster care or going to go into a residential treatment center. We need an array of services, and this is an important one that could be established through this program. What's worth noting is that you didn't see HHSC listed in that appropriation slides earlier. If you look at the budget, you won't find anything that specifically allocates money to this program, but the language of the budget does also say that this program is expected to happen. So HHSC is going to have to look at their operating budget and figure out how this fits in to that operating budget. I've had some initial conversations. They do plan to move forward with this despite that allocation issue. So we will see exactly how that comes to manifest itself. The other thing that I wanted to note, and this could really go into bringing justice, but it fits here as well. I want to note that for the first time this session, our legislature has really changed the way that it views buyers of prostitution versus what I'm calling, for lack of a better word, sellers of prostitution, those individuals engaged in prostitution themselves. Up until this year, buyers and sellers face the exact same penalties. They're the penalties that you see right there. On the first offense, it's a Class B misdemeanor. On your second and third, a Class A. And on the fourth offense, a state jail felony. So whether you're buying or selling sex in Texas up until September 1st, those are the penalties that you faced. As a result of this session, our legislature said, well, we think that the buyers are a bit more culpable than the sellers. And so we want to change the way that we respond to that. And in an attempt to provide those engaged in prostitution with additional opportunities for services on the first misdemeanor arrest and on the first state jail felony, it's going to be mandatory probation for those individuals. So instead of sending those individuals straight to jail, they're going to be on probation. And if a specialty court for prostitution exists in the area, they're going to participate in that specialty court. So the vision, I think, behind this, and this was a task force recommendation, is that, we don't want to just send all of these folks in prostitution straight to jail. We recognize that there are a lot of services available through these specialty courts, a lot of services through community supervision that might help somebody if they are potentially a victim that hasn't identified yet as a victim, to get the resources that they need to exit that life. I do want to point out that if they are a confirmed trafficking victim already, arrested for prostitution, they, one, shouldn't be charged by their prosecutor because they recognize that they're a victim, not an offender. Second is that they do have an affirmative defense available. They've had that for many years. So if they're arrested for prostitution as an adult, but they're a trafficking victim, they can raise that affirmative defense. These are for those folks that the system hasn't seen indicators that they're not engaged as adults willfully, and they want to provide those services. Now, what's new for the buyers, instead of following that initial trajectory of misdemeanor, state jail felony, now for buyers, it's a Class A misdemeanor on the first offense and a state jail felony on the second offense. So a considerable enhancement for the buyers there. And we may see, if you live in a community where buyers were not prioritized for prosecution, hopefully this enhanced penalty will make it a little more desirable for prosecutors in your community to pursue buyers. I did also want to note it has been for years a second-degree felony if it was a minor they were purchasing, so that was always an enhancement. This is when we're talking about adults engaged in prostitution, either as buyers or as sellers. Here's again a list here. The one thing I will highlight from this list that we haven't talked about, well, two things, I guess. First, again, Senate Bill 11, that school safety bill. It actually has a component in there that creates a statewide child mental health care consortium. And so that is using universities to help connect kids with the mental health services that they need, to use telemedicine. So this is not specific to trafficking, but it's a major gap in the state for all types of kids, and especially kids with exploitation, to get their mental health needs met. This was originally in a different bill that died just right before session ended, but was resurrected as an amendment to Senate Bill 11. And then finally there at the bottom, you'll see Senate Bill 821. It doesn't change a ton, but it looks at our children's advocacy centers, and it basically updates their legislation to more closely align with how they operate. And because they're such a key partner for us in providing care coordination, I did want to highlight those changes and how it envisions who's at the table for that multidisciplinary response. Finally, before we get into the Bringing Justice section, we have just a little bit left. We've got about 15 minutes left. So I want to remind you guys, since you're muted, to please use that question box if you have any questions that we can get to at the end. I saw a couple of folks ask about copies of the PowerPoint. So yes, if you joined a little bit late, we will be making sure that everybody that registered does get a copy of this PowerPoint. For Bringing Justice, a few bills to highlight. First is House Bill 3800. This looks at the way we collect data on trafficking around the state. There was a lot of confusion this session, different people quoting different numbers about trafficking. That's because there's a lot of different ways to collect data. Our Office of Court Administration has filings on certain charges. Our Department of Public Safety has uniform crime reports, but also computerized criminal history. There's been research from universities that estimate certain prevalence rates. Our child welfare system is mandated to provide a report on trafficking and runaways, and none of these numbers quite match up. It causes a lot of confusion for folks. And so one of the ways that the legislature is hoping we can have a more complete look at this is through House Bill 3800. This is basically going to require that law enforcement agencies and prosecution agencies in counties over 50,000 people will start reporting to the Attorney General's office information related to investigations involving trafficking and prosecutions concerning trafficking. So we'll have to see exactly how that plays out. The Attorney General's office will be able to create some rules that help give some guidance on that. And they are required to work with a university in order to fulfill the data collection and analysis for this. So you can see it's sort of a tiered rollout. Our larger counties and our statewide DPS will have to start doing this August 1st, 2020. Our mid-sized, smaller counties will start doing this the following year, August 1st, 2021. So I imagine we might see some early adopters if this all gets sorted out, but this will be a place to revisit how we understand trafficking data in Texas, and eventually could potentially become a way to share some law enforcement information. That's a need and a gap that a lot of law enforcement agencies have identified. It's not the exact language of this bill, but it is broad enough to potentially allow others besides law enforcement to dump data in here as well. So if DFPS wanted to provide data, or TDLR, this could potentially be a statewide repository for a lot of different data sets around trafficking. And part of that reason is because there's another provision that we're not highlighting here. It was in another bill that also gives the Attorney General's office authority to collect data and information related to the task force. So that's a much broader list of participants than just law enforcement. So those task force members would also be able to provide information here. I did want to note a slight change to what coercion means. Again, coercion is not required when you're talking about child sex trafficking. If a kid's engaged in that commercial sex act, they are a victim, regardless of the use of force, fraud, or coercion. In the 85th session, the legislature created a definition of coercion that applies only for adult sex trafficking. So if an adult is sex trafficked through force, fraud, or coercion, the legislature just said, we specifically want to include control of government records and ID as a potential form of coercion. So that happened in the 85th. In the 86th, they broadened that to say not just control of identification, but also when a trafficker uses forced intoxication as a tool for coercion, or when the trafficker controls access to a controlled substance or drug in order to manipulate their victim. That could also be a form of coercion. So you see now in the adult sex trafficking statute, in this session, they added the same definition to compelling prostitution, that any of these three things by statute could be a form of coercion. We'll see how that plays out. I think a lot of prosecutors feel like they already could have argued that those were forms of coercion. Years ago, we actually had a very long laundry list of different things that qualified as coercion, and there was some concern that if it wasn't on the list, it didn't qualify. So this is not meant to be an exhaustive list of coercion. Prosecutors have the ability to argue all sorts of things are forms of force, fraud, or coercion, but the legislature felt like these were being missed and worth highlighting. It's also worth noting that the task force had intended for this definition of coercion to, at least if it's going to exist, apply to labor trafficking as well, because coercion is an element for labor trafficking. And unlike sex trafficking, force, fraud, or coercion is required even for children. But given the current state of things, there was a little bit of messiness during session. At one point it applied to both, and then it only applied to this. So at this time, there's no additional definition of coercion for labor trafficking. This applies specifically to adult sex trafficking and to compelling prostitution. Now buckle up, everybody, hang in there, because this is where the lawyer nerd has a lot of words on the screen. So the reason that I show you this suite of offenses is because these are all prostitution and commercial sex offenses that you saw earlier in the presentation, right? When we looked at the definition of trafficking, victims are forced to engage in these activities. This is the conduct that they might be engaged in as victims. So I just wanted to highlight some of the changes we saw across this suite of offense. And basically what we saw were enhancements almost entirely across this suite of offense. So we already talked about buyers of prostitution. We saw that enhancement for purchasing an adult go from a Class B to a Class A and then to a state jail felony. No change for purchasing a minor. That was already a sex offender offense. Then for each of the rest of these, you basically saw a level enhancement. So promotion of prostitution was previously a state jail felony on the first, and then a third-degree felony on the second. That was enhanced to a third-degree and second-degree felony. Promotion of a minor was enhanced also to a first-degree felony. Aggravated promotion saw an enhancement for adults to a first-degree felony. They also saw sex offender registration added for aggravated promotion of an adult. And it was added to a list of what we call 3G offenses. That really is kind of an outdated term based on where those offenses used to live in the code. But 3G offenses basically are ones that have additional limitations on probation and parole. So folks that are charged and convicted with these offenses don't have the same opportunities for probation they might otherwise have. You also saw that sex offender registration and probation limitation added for aggravated promotion of children. And similarly, for compelling prostitution, you saw that enhancement to a first degree for compelling an adult. It was already a first degree 3G sex offender offense for compelling of a minor. But so you can see here, basically, the penalties are the same now for compelling prostitution and aggravated promotion of prostitution. For each of those offenses as well, you can no longer get deferred adjudication after your first offense. So that's not going to be available to defendants. And then finally, I did want to note that limitation on probation, there is an exception in the law because I think the legislature was concerned that occasionally a trafficking victim may be charged. Maybe that person has become the bottom and they've been charged with compelling prostitution. They did build in an exception to that probation limitation for victims. So if that person can show that there's some trafficking victimization there, they're not going to get off the hook for compelling another person, but they won't be faced with the same 3G enhancements that they may have been faced with otherwise. The only change to trafficking actually was that there's no deferred adjudication at all, even on the first offense. So you might notice there, a little bit of confusion on some of the penalties, not so much with victimization of minors, because we now have basically first degree across the suite of offenses for exploiting a minor, with the exception of buyers who face second degree. But there were no changes to exploitation of adults, so that's a second degree, even though compelling and ag were promoted to first degree. So I think prosecutors are going to have to be, pretty creative in how they decide which in this suite of offenses is appropriate based on the probation limitations, based on the penalty ranges. And I imagine this will be something that's probably revisited next session to make sure we have the right penalty range for each of these, and also the online versions that have been added as well. I haven't left much time for questions, so I want to wrap up these last little bits as quickly as I can, and we might go just 2 minutes over, but if you have to sign off, that's fine. I wanted to highlight the orders of non-disclosure. This was a task force recommendation, also a proposal from the governor. Basically, orders of non-disclosure, it's a remedy that you have if you have a conviction on your record. It's basically a record sealing remedy. So you are legally allowed, after you get this non-disclosure, to deny this ever happened. You're filling out a housing application or job application. You don't have to say that this ever happened. And we've had in Texas for a while a process specifically for trafficking victims. If they had one of these convictions on the left, but they only had it because they were a trafficking victim, they could go through this process. The problem is there's a lot to the process. They had to get straight probation. They couldn't have served any jail time. They had to then, after their probation, get this thing called a set-aside, do that successfully. Then after the set-aside, they could do their petition. And if the court approved, they could get that non-disclosure. What we found was literally 0 people were pursuing this non-disclosure remedy. It was just a bit too onerous for people to do. So the changes that we saw this session, there were no changes to the list of qualifying offenses except for one. That was promotion of prostitution is no longer an eligible offense. That's because the Class A promotion of prostitution no longer exists. That saw an enhancement, so there are no more arrests for Class A moving forward for that. But the other offenses are still there. Prostitution even applies to felony level. So the big changes here are that it's no longer limited to those placed on probation. Even if you did jail time, you're able to petition for this. And the other really big thing is that it allows for consolidation. So if you are a survivor who has picked up charges for these offenses in Houston, but also in San Antonio and in Dallas, no longer are you going to have to go to Harris County, Dallas County, and Bexar County and make individual petitions for this. You can consolidate those into the most recent court and make that petition in a consolidated manner. I don't know of any other state that does that. So that's a great benefit to those pursuing this remedy. The one additional thing that they did add into this law is that if you are pursuing this non-disclosure because you were a victim, that if you're requested by law enforcement to provide any basic information related to that exploiter, you need to make some minimum effort to provide that information. Again, there are carve-outs to that. If you're unable to provide that due to your trauma, or you're unable to provide that due to your age, they have those exceptions. But that is one thing that the legislature thought was fair to add into that. But other than that, if you have that, you can show you were a victim and that's why you engaged in that activity, you can pursue those petitions. And we won't get into details here, but you'll have this list of a couple of lists of bills that passed related to bringing justice during this session. You have all of our contact information there. So we do have just a few minutes left, and I see some questions that have come in during the webinar. So if anybody has any questions, feel free to type those in. I'm going with my bad eyesight to see if I can read these questions. Yes, again, the PowerPoint will be available to folks, and if all goes well, this recording will be available as well. We have some questions about what satisfies the requirement for education in schools for students and staff. Are there specified materials or agencies we should be obtaining training from? That's a great question. Basically, when it comes to the superintendents and the school boards, you will see some specific requirements. There's going to be some rulemaking tied to those things. State Board of Education is going to have to be involved. So I would expect that sometime in the spring to know a little bit more about what that looks like. The education service centers are typically highly involved in providing those existing requirements, but we may see where you could become an authorized provider if you cover certain components. We just don't know yet because that implementation hasn't happened. When it comes to the requirements for schools and for students, the requirements are just there. Nobody audits them. It basically is going to follow the same process that you're currently responsible for when it comes to your child abuse training and requirements. So you have those training requirements, you interpret them, you're required to keep tabs of them, but nobody's going to come in and see, did you cover these particular things? So recognize that the law requires those things, that disabilities has to be included. I think the biggest gap that we've seen around the state is schools not knowing that prevention education component is there. In conversations with TEA and TASB, we're hopeful that they can give some guidance on resources that are available, but at the end of the day, the school districts have the local control to decide how they want to fulfill those requirements around training. CACs are a major partner for child abuse training. They can incorporate trafficking. Your local coalition is another great provider for that. There's lots of resources there. Some questions about coercion. Yes, again, those added definitions are not meant to be exclusive. So if somebody, there was a question about, for example, withholding food. I mean, any sort of threat or manipulation that could cause somebody to engage in that activity could be a form potentially of either force or threat or coercion. Let's see, any more questions here? Yes, you may notice that we have our map of regional administrators, and they are all filled except for one. That's the South Texas position. So that position is posted online. Please, that position has been open far too long. We know that these regions are very large. It's a lot to ask somebody to take on this major task. These regions are so big and so many folks that need assistance, but we're hoping to get some additional really quality applications there. Okay, I'm not seeing any other questions. Let me just check the chat real quick. Yeah, so I just want to thank everybody for joining us today. Thank you for being part of this. If you have any questions, again, you have our contact information here on this slide. You also have your local regional administrator there if you have questions about particular services and support needed in your region. We'll do our best to make sure you all get copies of these slides as quickly as we can, and the recording if all goes well. Thanks so much and have a great rest of your day.